Hello, this is Dragonfly and our 6th episode of our Halo 5 Force tutorial. And in this episode, we're going to discuss boundaries and how we can do scripting with boundaries for a variety of different effects. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and start with 3 already established boundaries in which we can go ahead and work with and see how we can move forward from there. Alright, so I haven't scripted anything yet, but I did establish the boundaries, as you can see with these transparent boxes. And each building is going to be something pretty interesting with its boundaries. And we will go ahead and take care of that, tackle everything we need to cover in this episode. So let's go ahead and get started then. The first thing we're going to go ahead and do is establish a script here with a script brain object. So this would be our object. This is another type of object that you can find under extras under scripting. Essentially, the script brain actually doesn't do anything. It's an object that is invisible and it's designed to run scripts, and that's about it. There's no way to interact with it unless you script it to do so, and you can't really operate on it like a switch or anything else like that. So script brains are very good for doing scripting behind the scenes, or for establishing these boundary lines and these points where the players would cross to do something, and definitely very versatile piece of object. So you can definitely do a lot with script brains. Now, let's go ahead and focus on this first building. This building is going to, this particular script brain, what it's going to do is going to change the weather and the lighting of the area depending on whether you're inside or outside of the building. So we're gonna go ahead and press the U key, and we're gonna go ahead and go to lighting, and we're gonna change the theme of the skybox. Now we're currently in the map title, and title is actually a very excellent map for creating a lot of conditions for lighting, such as darkness, clear skies, among other things. But the one I go to for sure is stormy, and I'll go over that later. So let's go ahead and change the skybox to stormy. Okay, perfect. So now we have a darker environment. It's a lot more gloomy, a lot more stormy here, but we haven't done anything yet. Next thing we're gonna go ahead and do is we're gonna mess around with the screen effects of the map. Now, the skybox cannot be changed via scripting, but the screen effects can be changed via scripting, and that actually helps a lot in terms of immersion and gameplay for many different reasons. And let's go ahead and continue with the screen effects. Now, if you were to mess around with the screen effects, you would realize that you could change the lighting in many different ways. But for title, I like to pick blue because it provides a higher contrast and a much more sharper darkness in general side. So you see that everything is just very dark right now and you can't really see anything. And with the effects, let me go ahead and reset this back to none. So with our effects, we can go ahead and use a variety of different effects. We can use dust, we can use embers, we can use motes, and it's basically particle effects that are used in the game to provide that extra level of depth in gameplay. It makes the place look very beautiful. So we're gonna go ahead and switch to heavy rain, and we're gonna leave this alone for now. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we're gonna script this brain to change the visual effects upon a player entering the boundary. So this is going to be a very interesting episode. Now, let's go ahead and press P for object properties on the script brain. And let's go ahead and add a script. We're gonna do 2 scripts, one for entering a boundary and one for exiting a boundary. So, since we already have our boundary established, what we need to do is set up an event in order to see what would happen if the player entered a boundary. Players alone don't have to be the ones triggering the boundary enter. Objects can do it as well, or both, but generally players is the safest and most reliable way to detect the boundary. Now, if you were to pick boundary check, there's different parameters that you can use to detect boundaries. You can check when the player enters the boundary, you can check when he exits the boundary, you can check when they do both. You can check if the player is continuously inside the boundary, but you need to be careful. This is very buggy. This doesn't really work in a very reliable fashion. However, there is a workaround that I'll go more on this later. So do not use continuous at all. It's gonna break your map. but everything else should be fine. And repeat pretty much the text every so often if this condition is met, if the player entered the boundary or whatever you like to set it up. So it's gonna check, for example, every 1 second if the player is inside the boundary, but for the sake of this particular script, we're gonna make it check constantly to see if players have entered the boundary or not. So what happens when a player enters the boundary? What is this thing going to do? We're going to do something very simple. We're gonna go all the way to the bottom of the actions list, and we are going to change screen effects set. And this is going to change the screen effects of whatever player you want to have their effects changed. Now, when you do that, like our previous tutorials, you go to players and you pick whichever type of player you would like this to have this attributed to. So this is basically, you can do all players, you can do teams, you can do for example, boundary this or that. You know, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the best way by far, the simplest way, would be to use the activator object. So like I previously mentioned in the previous tutorials, the activator object is the object that triggers the event. In this case, it would be the player. The player would be the activator object. So that one specific player would have his visual effects change once he enters that building by crossing that boundary. So this is how we're gonna do it. Usually, the default setting is ignore, and basically the script would just ignore changes to the filter and the effects. But basically, we want to go ahead and change this to a darker screen effect. So we're gonna go ahead and go to gloom. We're gonna change it back to gloom, and it's gonna be darker when you go inside, and we'll take care of the rest after that. For the effects, we're going to go ahead and put none, because you know we're not gonna allow rain inside the building because that's not realistic. So we're gonna set this to none, and we're gonna leave all of this alone. Alright, cool. So now we have our first script. So what happens when the player exits the boundary? Well, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna go to the bottom of the actions list, change the screen effects. We're gonna change it to default, and we're gonna set the activator object, the player, in order to set it to default, just like that. And it'll be back to normal as soon as the player exits the boundary by exiting the building. So let's go ahead and see how this works. There we go. See? Totally dark in here. Okay, so that's cool. Now what? So what happens when he exits the room? It goes clear and it starts raining again. Just like that, right? We can also do something pretty cool. In situations like these, basically we can just go ahead and add a scripting object in which we can use Scriptable Power-Up. Basically, these are power-ups that you can script to act a certain way once they're activated, and it's really cool what you can do with these things. They're very versatile. Just try not to be confused. Don't look them up in gameplay, look them up in extras in scripting. So we're gonna use the active camo power-up. This doesn't actually give you active camo, it just gives you the effect of active camo. Like it looks like it's a active camo object. So we're gonna go ahead and place this here. Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go ahead and assign the script to it, and we're not gonna see this again, so I guess we can go ahead and do that. 30 seconds for respawn, whatever. Let's go ahead and ignore that. Let's focus on this. So we do a script, right? And just like with the terminal in the previous episodes, we can actually use an interactive event to detect when the player interacts with this object. So what we can go ahead and do is give the player night vision. And this is how we're gonna do it. We're gonna use the activator as the person who triggered the event, and then we're gonna go ahead and change the effect to flood, and we're gonna ignore this. So there we go. Alright, so let's take a look here real quick. Boom, pitch black. I see this active camo here. And now I have night vision. See? Interesting how we can play around with these screen effects. So, let's go ahead and exit the building. We're back to normal again. Now we're gonna go ahead and focus on our second building. For the second building, we're going to assign a different script that still involves boundaries. Now, you need to pay close attention to this one because we're not gonna use a boundary we're not gonna use a boundary check event. We're going to use a timer check event. We're gonna set the timer to 1 second. Okay, so it's gonna be counting 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, and with each second, it's gonna run a number of actions. So in this case, what we're gonna go ahead and do is we're gonna create a toxic environment. There's toxic gas inside the building. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is we're gonna leave this alone. It's gonna do 10% damage to anybody who is inside the boundary. That's pretty much how we do it. And it's gonna check for the timer every 1 second. Every 1 second, it's gonna be causing 10% damage to any players inside the boundary. Cool. Alright, let's go in there. As you can see, I start losing health because I'm inside the boundary of the script brain. As soon as I exit the boundary, I don't lose any more health. That's a pretty cool way to create an effect. Here, we're gonna do something more interesting. What we're gonna go ahead and do here is that we're going to create a script for this guy, and we're going to create something that constantly triggers itself. What we're gonna go ahead and do is we're gonna set the timer to 0.1 second, and we're gonna use the move offset action. And what we're gonna go ahead and do is that I already assigned a label to this fire. This is user alpha. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is use that one user alpha object, and we're gonna move them towards anything within this boundary, but it would need to be players and not dead players. Need to be alive, so that is cool. Alright, so what we're doing here is that this object is going to be manipulating this object, the label alpha object, to hunt down players that are inside this boundary. And it's gonna move the flame over to the player within 3 seconds. Normally you would not want this to be interrupted. However, you do want to go ahead and click condition interrupt this time, simply because the fire will have a more smoother movement. It won't be a jagged path like it would normally do if it was resetting itself. So let's go ahead and show you a brief demonstration. Alright, so that fire is currently approaching me right now, as scripted. But as soon as I exit the boundary, it's gonna stay still. It's kind of like a guard dog. So let's go back in there again, and it's going to continue attacking me because the script brain is commanding it to attack. So yeah, that's pretty much some of the uses that you can have for boundaries when in relation to scripting. It's pretty cool stuff that you can do here. Definitely isolate a lot of things. So I hope you enjoyed this video and have fun making those maps.